Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Midnight Mass. Book 1, Genesis, or Season 1, Episode 1, however you want to dip that down in whichever. So, I was watching this episode and I was trying to figure out what the hook of the show was in this episode. I was trying to figure out, I'm like, okay, what is the uniquest thing about this show, besides these people seemingly being religious people? Like, I was trying to figure out like what the real legitimate thing was, because like, could people be haunted about things? Like, it seems like there is to be this thing about like consistent either ghost stories, or really just we have Riley's character, who seems to, before he is to sit his head, before he is to fall asleep at night, every day he is to supposedly see the girl of which that he had killed. Um, and so, like, I was trying to put together like what the hook of the show was, like the overall, like, what is the actual like appeal of the show? Like, there, like, is there some event that they're building to? Is there some, like, it has to be like, there's a reason why there was these like ghost stories going on uh, with uh, with Warren Flint, who ended up going out with these kids, just kind of like tell ghost stories and stuff like that. Like, so I was thinking, I'm like, okay, there's got to be some kind of something here. Um, Also, it kind of seemed interesting where uh, they had to quickly, all of a sudden, like, uh, disprove something about this preacher within this first episode. So I'm like, so is it going to be a quick thing that we're eventually going to find out that this maybe pastor isn't who he says that he is what I'm assuming is happening. Father Paul, that's where his name is. Thank God. Um, so going into this episode, I'm trying to figure out and trying to put the pieces together, but it's in episode one. I'm obviously thinking that we are also going to get a flashback of things at some point in this show, because obviously there are to be characters that are to really not actually be their age, obviously. So I'm like, wait a minute. So this is like that Jupiter superhero show, kind of, where you have people that look way older than they actually are, so that way you can just easily have flashbacks, and like the people will look younger, and you can just kind of like, that, like, that's a very, that's a very smart maneuver, but you can also obviously tell that these people are to be like not the age that they actually are. You can tell it's makeup, but um either way, like, it's really just still early for the show for me to really just assess everything that is going to go on with it. And I would say that this show so far is like just okay, because like I don't really understand, like, I'm not really getting the big scope of things, of what I really want. I'm like, okay, like, what's really going on? Like, it just seems like everybody's to just like, within this first episode, we're just getting to know people, or get, like, having people reunite with people that they seemingly have a familiar past with. And we're getting attached to this town uh, to eventually see where that goes. So I think that's all that I have to say about this in a very cryptic like sense. Uh, but one thing that I want to say is that evidently this has to do seemingly with a very religious family, and also a very seemingly like these people are to do religious stuff. So within one episode, people may or may not enjoy that kind of thing, or maybe like when people are to talk about religion, that makes people uncomfortable. But this show is also called Midnight Mass, so people should have figured that out when you kind of have like a picture of a church in front of in front of a thing of a show. People should probably have figured that out. But for me, like, I'll be honest, uh, I'm not a real religious person. So if there's something that people should have thought that I should have realized or recognized, or whichever of what's going on in the show, uh, I am just a person who ended up watching one episode of this show to just see what it was about, because I didn't really much understand what it was about. I just went into this show because it was like, oh hey, something's interesting. People on Netflix. Let's check this out. So like, yeah, I just took it from a person that just saw something that was to click on Netflix, and that's about it. So with that said, let's go and let's talk about this episode. Let's go into spoilers of this episode, uh, and call it a day. So let's go out of our way to say it's about that coveted time yet again to go into this thing called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this episode. So the very beginning of this episode, there is to be a car accident. So Riley is off to the side, just kind of being like treated for scratches and scrapes and whatever that he had received upon this car accident. And there is to be another woman who is uh, to be getting uh, air breathed into her. And so Riley's like, well, this girl's going to be all right. Like, won't she? Like, she'll survive, right? So they're evidently doing CPR on her, and so we all of a sudden have Riley, who is to start to go into uh, kind of praying and also just trying to like uh, do his like kind of Our Father who art in heaven, all kingdom come, by would be, yeah, all I'm not even going to try to uh, like, I'm not a religious person. And I went and watched Midnight Mass thing. That was dumb, but hey, like, I just want to watch any kind of show or kind of movie. And plus, you also just randomly roll the thing of things. So whichever, like, freaking, like, might as well watch any number of things to just kind of test the waters. So all of a sudden, this guy is to mention the guy that was kind of cleaning this guy's wounds. It's like, yeah, go and ask your God why is it that he ends up leaving uh, certain women dead, but then like the drunk guy uh, is to eventually like get out of here without a scratch. Like, ask your God that why like you didn't die, but she did. So fast forward, so Riley is to be going to court, and he is to go in there and is to, of course, be told that he is to be going to prison for 4 years. Like, they said 4 to 10, but like obviously he's just gonna go in there for 4 years because this guy probably has never gotten a blip or anything like that. Probably on his record, he's probably gonna get the least sentence and whichever. So this guy ends up going to prison, and weirdly enough, like he's in a prison cell where he's all on his own, which I'm like, okay, like I would have thought that he would have been like bunkered down with somebody, but I guess he was completely on his own. How convenient is that, I guess? But I don't know, maybe there's certain prisons where like it's like one to a thing or whatever. So Riley goes ahead and goes and sits his little head, and before he ends up going and falling asleep, all he sees is the girl of which that he had killed, and like the last image that I guess is going to burn into his mind every single time he ends up resting his head is evidently going to be this woman kind of just looking at him every single day of his life, and so on and so forth. So fast forward to 4 years later, just why not? So we can just speed up this whole prison sentence, because I'm sure there's going to be probably a prison flashback sequence, something of Riley doing something in prison, probably. Because I'm assuming that there's probably going to be a mass amount of flashbacks here for any number of things, so that way they can kind of really just stretch out the story, probably. I'm assuming somewhere. Would make a lot of sense. So, uh, excuse me. So, uh, so Riley's mother, who I believe is Annie, because her picture doesn't really justify her age in the show. So Annie is to eventually tell her younger son Warren that Riley is coming home today, coming home from prison. So like they're just kind of like gearing up for him to come home, and so uh, Riley eventually does come home, and eventually we have this sheriff who is to uh, of arrested this guy for being like I guess drunk and disorderly, and like he was talking about this weird animal that I guess had the like these long wings and stuff like that. Like this guy was just talking all kinds of weird stuff. Uh, but then like the sheriff just let him off, just let him go. And so on to Riley coming back because Anna is to mention the sheriff that is like, oh hey, like I'm sorry that I wasn't like on my shift. I decided to take a day off because I wanted to make sure that Riley got home. And sheriff's like, okay, fine, whatever. So Riley ends up coming home to finding that his room is just to kind of get filled with a bunch of like storage stuff because Riley wasn't home anyways. So uh eventually what ends up happening is uh eventually they start going on to dinner, and they eventually talk about like, well, hey, uh like Riley, how, like we're going to church tomorrow, like hey, like gear up for that. And Riley's like, well, I don't want to go to church. I don't want to go. Like, no. And because this is interesting, because immediately once he was to be at prison, he had his Bible with him, and evidently he ended up just getting rid of it. And so when he came back and talking over the dinner table about church, Riley's like, you know what? I'm not interested. Like we end up finding out that evidently Riley, when talking to uh, evidently Aaron Green, he ends up mentioning within this episode that he decided to become an atheist. He decided that he had went through and kind of tried to find some kind of religion in prison, and he just couldn't find anything. Like he couldn't. He went through every single uh, thing of religion that he could find to eventually find his variation of God, and he gave up and he decided to just not believe in anything, which is kind of interesting. So, because evidently this guy did a ton of reading in prison. So, but yeah, so once Riley is to tell like his parents that he's like, you know what, I'm not interested. All of a sudden, because Riley is still technically on parole right now, evidently, and I'm assuming Riley will soon get like a job and any number of obligations and stuff that he has to kind of deal with because he Riley already mentioned that he's going to have to go and do AA, which is Alcoholic Anonymous, which I'm assuming like he had to do that because uh, like basically what he was charged with, which was him like basically having him basically being drunk and eventually just uh, having a car accident that killed another person. Yeah, probably just go ahead and do Alcoholic Anonymous. So Riley went on uh, to say that he wasn't going to go do church. Then all of a sudden, his father is just like, you know what? Like you can come back home and whatever and everything that's fine and whatever you're gonna do whatever, but like you not coming to church and you kind of joking around about it and whatever, like no, like you're gonna go to church, like basically just consider it a part of your parole thing that you are gonna go to church, like at least go there, like how, like if the mood doesn't strike yet, it doesn't matter, just go anyways, just go regardless. So Riley's like, okay, fine, like because and eventually they kind of like double over that because eventually Riley is to talk about his dad, and so like his dad is just like so hey, like you just don't want to go to church, right? And Riley's like, well, yeah. And his father's like, okay, like you know what, like just please just go, and like once we get to a certain part of church you don't have to participate. And then everybody like goes and looks at Riley and is like, oh, you didn't participate. It's like not everybody has to do everything, right? Like but they ended up like pointing at him and like, hey, you didn't do it, you weren't, you like so uh but yeah, so Riley ends up talking to his brother while at dinner, because evidently Warren evidently is a uh, like is one of the choir boy ish like people. God, what was it called? I didn't know the exact term. Like he is to be working with the preacher during the sermons, and he is to do certain things to kind of do prep work for stuff. And weirdly, there was a part where Warren was to be told to do some prep work, but it was weirdly already done. So, so Warren and Riley were kind of just talking about the pastor that they have had that that Riley had kind of mentioned that this guy has kind of seen better days or better seasons, and that eventually it's not going to be long before eventually this guy either dies or something, just because like he's getting up there in age and whatever. Uh, so what ends up happening is, I guess, a person who ends up working for the church, I guess, ends up seeing the pastor, and I guess he ended up, I'm assuming, passing away. And so we end up having Father Paul, who ends up coming and doing the sermon and helping out and just kind of mentioning that supposedly the other pastor had gotten ill, and evidently this guy was to go off and do some kind of vacation or some kind of something, and he had taken ill. So this guy is to come in here and just help out the church for however long that they need him. So, uh, so eventually we have Father Paul, who's kind of doing stuff in a very, I guess, old fashioned way, to where eventually we end up having like Ed Flint or Flynn, who's the dad of that whole family. Ed, he ends up mentioning to the preacher, it's like, well, man, I haven't heard like the old ways of doing things for like 10 years. Like it's interesting to have this preacher who's kind of doing something in an old fashioned kind of way. But here's the weird thing. So we end up having one of the girls who works with the church, who's all of a sudden seeing uh, Father Paul, who doesn't evidently have the right like robe on. Evidently, like he had this gold robe, but he was actually supposed to wear this green robe. And Father Paul's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Like, this was the only one that I had on me because I couldn't find the other robe." And the girl's like, "Well, I can order any kind of robes that you need." And he's like, "No, I'm sure I can just find the other robe. Like, just give me time." So I'm just kind of like, okay, is there something about that where eventually we're going to find out that this guy isn't what he seems to be? Or there's some kind of, I don't know, like already there's some kind of uneasiness with this character, because eventually there is to be this weathering of the storm, which I just thought was just kind of weird. So because eventually what ends up happening, let's talk about Riley going and speaking with Aaron. So Riley goes on and sees Aaron, and evidently like he knows her from his past. Maybe he uh like probably her and him are probably the same age. It seems that Riley is to be interested in talking with Aaron because also it seems that she was married but may no longer be married. So Riley is to see Aaron in church, and Aaron is to see Riley in church. And plus also Aaron had went and gotten and did a ultrasound uh, with Dr. Sarah Gunning. And so it seems that Aaron had gotten this ultrasound, and supposedly there had been some kind of supposed bleeding problem, which supposedly they're to be concerned about. But so Aaron ends up seeing Riley eventually come into town, and so she's like, maybe, like, maybe he can be the father of my child. Uh, so Aaron and Riley after church go and like walk Aaron back to her place, and so they kind of do this catching up where it seems that Aaron was married and was with a guy, but that just for whatever reason didn't work out. And evidently Aaron went to New York, and Riley is just like, well, yeah, we thought like you were like trying to be an actor or any number of things, and she's like, no, no. Like, so eventually, I guess we'll find out more about these characters because we really didn't find much about anybody in this in this show. For like, we barely get to like know little bits of things. Evidently, Riley went to school and then like college, and then decided to do some stocks on things. Just tried to do a startup company, but eventually that whole accident happened and just wiped that all out. So eventually, uh, Aaron and Riley. So Aaron is to be back at her place, and so Aaron is just kind of asking Riley, it's like how do you feel? And he's like, I'm okay. And she's like, no, how do you really feel? Like how like is coming back here like is that weird for you after spending 4 years in prison? Like is that weird? So Riley is like, you know what? Like prison was actually really easy. Uh I don't know how. Like he like what I mean by that is Riley is like, well, like there was to be a purpose for Riley in prison to just like do the day-to-day things, uh counting down the days. He had purpose in prison. Like he had some kind of goal to achieve, and this and that. But when all of a sudden Riley came back home, he's realizing like how am I going to be able to like get a job when people know that I've done what I've done? How am I going to be able to uh like what is my purpose eventually going to be? Like it's kind of interesting because I wonder how long Riley has really thought about this. Maybe that led to his accident or his car accident was him just realizing that like he had nothing. Maybe that's the reason why like he just went into the dark path of which that he did, and maybe prison gave him hope. But then eventually when he left prison he just realized that, well, I'm back to where I am. I don't know. Like I don't know, I think that they should have really gone into his headset a little bit more, of what exactly all this of what he said really meant, where uh, like he has no purpose here. Uh, oh, also Ed evidently is to be working on a boat, and it seems that times were tough and a lot of people had died, seemingly because times were tough. Um, and either people had died or there had been like certain kind of things that um, all of a sudden like people were going through hard times because of what Ed's job was related to, weirdly enough. And so then eventually Riley, who had gotten an update of like what happened to his like father and his thing that he has been doing, that's when uh, reasonably, because it seems like Ed has had a lot of like you can tell like Ed is to consistently be distant from his son. Like when Riley's mother was on the phone with Riley, like the dad didn't really want a phone conversation with him or call him or whatever while he was in prison. So it's like, okay, so like the dad probably doesn't care for his oldest son, because I guess it's just like, hey man, you made a huge mistake. So, anyways, pushing on. So, eventually there is to be some storm, and Riley's to mention about that. And so Aaron is like, well, maybe that could be just a like a goal for you or a project for you. It's like just something simple to just kind of get you to the next day, and the next day some little thing that eventually you can accomplish, that like just getting through a storm is just going to be what your purpose is. So like eventually like this guy is probably just going to have little tiny goals to eventually make his day meaningful, which is kind of interesting. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how Riley's story plays out, or how much more we get to understand of this character. Is really what I'm kind of fascinated in. Um, so we go into this storm, and so all of a sudden we end up having Riley, who is to bizarrely see Father Paul on this side of this beach. And so Riley goes out to chase after him, but like bizarrely Riley could not run fast enough to get to Father Paul, and then eventually Father Paul just vanishes, and so Riley just heads back home because there's nothing he can do. So, and plus also it's crazy to continue to be out there, and plus you'll also catch pneumonia. So or pneumonia, however you pronounce that. So eventually they go on and just kind of sleep it off. And so the very next day, they end up trying to call, but the phones are dead. So they end up wanting to go and like check to find out if Father Paul is okay. So they end up doing that. Eddie's to mention that he is to go and want to check on his boat. While they end up leaving their home, all of a sudden they end up seeing like there is a bunch of dead cats on the side of this beach that are being kind of picked away by these birds. And I'm like, okay, what does that all mean? Because there's a scene here that I'm going to talk about. So evidently Warren is to evidently be really interested in this girl who is to evidently be handicapped, seemingly in a wheelchair, which like doesn't matter if you like a girl, you like a girl. Um, so Warren eventually is to go with these two other boys to just kind of tell these ghost stories. Seemingly one about some weird ghost sailor or something, and eventually, while they're kind of telling these stories by this fire, all of a sudden they end up seeing these like these yellow eyes in some part of this beach, and supposedly one of the kids like heard like cats making these aggressive well, everybody, all the guys heard like these cats making really aggressive noises, and they just immediately assumed that the cats were doing it. And but I'm assuming like somebody is going and either killing these cats or are eating maybe something with these cats or something, which I don't know exactly what that means. And maybe we're gonna have something to do with the Father Paul, and him and these cats. Maybe, I don't know. Some weird assumptions being made here by me, um, but I'm trying to figure out what the connection is, because eventually we end up seeing another cat who ends up kind of roaming around, because evidently there's a ton of strays that are to be by the area of where Warren was. And they also mentioned that supposedly there had been a lot of dead bodies that eventually would uh, come from the side of the beach also, because I guess a lot of people eventually had buried bodies, and eventually they would wash up on shore. And so one of the kids was like, yeah, like bodies wash up all the time around where I'm at, because like everything would always wash up where I live. So but yeah, so these kids are just talking about things, and so like I hope that like I think I've kind of covered everything in a very rushed like manner. I probably didn't go into heavy details about whatever, but like this show is like, to me, I was just like, what is the hook? What is the hook of this show? Like, what is the like thing that is going to make me just go like, huh? Like, okay, this show just seems like more than just like people going to church and and just like common stuff. Um, but like that whole cat thing at the very end of this show, I'm like, maybe that's what the thing is. Maybe like there's to be eventually like weird things eventually going on, and I don't know. There's a lot of kind of just speculation going on right now. Oh, and we also have this the Doctor Gunning evidently was to have a mother of hers who had to switch rooms to go into like I guess a lower level room because her mother can't handle stairs anymore because she ended up breaking her hip. I'm like, oh, that's too bad. I'm like so evidently this girl must have some kind of like dementia or I don't. That's not right because I don't know much about that. Like maybe she has Alzheimer's or some kind of something, some kind of like mental thing going on with this woman. So that way her memory is not all that quite right because she ends up going up in there. It's like, hey, I woke up in a different room, and it's like, no, like you have to live in that kind of room because you can't go up the stairs anymore. So yeah, so that was a weird thing to kind of leave off at, but I'm just kind of remembering any little side things of this episode. So, uh, with that said, and it was like Riley talked about, Altar Boy. That's what I was going with. Like not like I was trying to think of what it was actually called. Like in Riley was talking about him being an altar boy just to get the chicks because a man in uniform. I was like, what? Like how is that the same thing as I guess like going into the military or whatever or being like a cop or whichever. Anyways, it'll be interesting to see how Riley gets reincorporated into the town because we never even saw him ever being incorporated in the town. So we'll see what happens with these characters. Um, I think this show will be fun. Like maybe I don't know. Like we just got like scenes here, and I was like, okay, I'm trying to connect things together already. I'm trying to like think of like what is going to be beyond this. So we'll see how the shows kind of just play out somehow or another. So yeah, if this is interesting to people, then I will continue to watch it. If no one cares, then good. I won't have to watch this. Like it's not like I could be either way about this. Because to me, I'm just like, hey, it's another thing to watch. But if no one cares, then it's like, hey, it's something I don't need to watch. Like it wasn't like to me this show was just kind of like okay. It was like something like seemingly like refreshing to watch. Uh oh, let's bring this up. So Father Paul was to point out that Riley didn't go and do the thing that everyone else did, and so like Riley used to mention it's like, well, like yeah, I don't really much like have a real belief in like church and stuff like that. And so like Father Paul is just like, well, hey, like there was a lot like Jesus ended up having people that didn't quite believe and like he ended up like making them his best friends or his friends or whatever to eventually help them believe. So like Father Paul was like, good. Like if somebody doesn't believe, like I can come in here and like and help someone believe. Good. Um, so yeah, we'll kind of see if Paul has a moment that he is to uh, eventually either re-find his way back to believing in God and heaven and whichever, or whatever he ends up going into the path of whatever he does. We'll see. Um, yeah. So, with that said, like, I hope one thing and one thing only, that I hope there isn't going to be, because I know it's bound to happen with something that is obviously a church connectional thing. Hopefully, no one is to be like a religious of people. Like for me, I'm just like meh. Like I just wanted to see something that seemed like a different kind of show. So hopefully, uh, no one is to just kind of go in here and to just kind of push any kind of thing. Like just, hey man, I'm watching a show. Like I'm just watching a show. Like I don't take it any more of that than whatever and what have you. People could eventually assess what's going on in the show, have your theory crafting of whatever you think is going on, unless you've seen the whole entire show. Please don't try to like spoil all of it. But again, that'll just be spoiling it for someone else because it won't really 100% matter to me either way. Um, but I will probably just remove the comment or whatever if it's a spoiler, just because it's to avoid other people or give other people the chance to not get spoiled about the show. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Yeah. So, hopefully, I covered everything. There might not have been every single stitch of second of scene or whatever show episode thing that might have slipped through the cracks. And there may be a rebuttal coming if that did happen. If something that comes up in the second episode reminds me of something that happened in the first episode. So, yeah. So hopefully we are done. I don't know. I'm also very tired right now, so I'm just kind of like brr. So yeah, so it's kind of like I feel like I should say more, but I'm just tired and done and whichever. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Goodbye everybody. Yeah. Bye.